2 hours ago, the White House issued a directive that NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe described in a private communication that has since been shared with 3 major defense outlets as the most operationally damaging self-inflicted action any alliance member has taken since NATO's founding in 1949. Not a withdrawal from the alliance. Something in some ways more immediately devastating. A unilateral American decision that triggered Canada's immediate suspension of its role in NATO's Northern Logistics Corridor, the supply chain architecture that moves American troops, equipment, and material from North American staging grounds to European deployment zones. The directive that triggered it, the White House, citing Canada's refusal to increase its NATO defense spending to 3% of GDP on Washington's demanded timeline, issued an executive memorandum reclassifying Canada's NATO contribution as insufficient for continued preferential access to American defense procurement contracts. The reclassification strips Canadian defense contractors of their status as preferred allied suppliers, subjects Canadian military technology exports to American security review delays of up to 180 days, and freezes Canadian participation in 4 active joint defense development programs worth a combined $18 billion. Washington's logic was familiar. Apply economic pressure to a specific sector, in this case defense industry revenue, and the political cost inside Canada would force Ottawa to the table. Canadian defense contractors facing lost American contracts would pressure the government to commit to the spending timeline. The strategy assumed Canada valued access to American defense procurement more than it valued operational leverage over NATO logistics. That assumption was wrong, and the name Canada had given to its response plan, prepared 11 months earlier, makes clear how precisely Carney had anticipated this specific move, Operation Keystone, not a reference to a pipeline, a reference to the architectural term for the stone at the top of an arch that holds every other stone in place. Remove the keystone and the arch collapses. The directive has 3 components. First, all Canadian defense contractors, including CAE, MDA Space, L3 Harris Canada, and Magellan Aerospace, are placed under enhanced American security review for any export requiring technology transfer. Enhanced review has no defined timeline. Contracts currently in negotiation are frozen pending clearance. Contracts already signed face retroactive compliance audits. The practical effect, Canadian defense industry revenue from American sources halts. Second, Canadian personnel currently embedded in American defense development programs are placed under access review, suspending their security clearances pending a 180-day evaluation. There are currently 1,200 Canadian defense engineers and scientists embedded across 14 active joint programs. Suspending their access mid-program does not pause those programs. It breaks them at points where Canadian expertise is not replaceable by any other allied nation at equivalent technical depth. Third, the memorandum instructs the Pentagon to begin contingency planning for NATO logistics operations that do not route through Canadian territory. The instruction is framed as prudent planning. Every NATO logistics officer who read it understood it as something else, an acknowledgement that Washington was prepared to fracture the Northern Logistics Corridor to win a defense spending argument. 54 minutes after the memorandum was made public, Canada's Minister of National Defense appeared at a joint podium with the Chief of the Defense Staff. The visual was deliberate. This was not a political response. This was a military one. The minister spoke for 6 minutes. He did not use the word retaliation once. He used the word architecture 11 times. NATO is not a collection of bilateral relationships between the United States and individual allies. It is an architecture. Every architecture has load-bearing elements. Canada is going to be very precise today about which elements we are and what happens to the structure when they are placed under stress. Then he announced 4 measures, each one targeting a different layer of the NATO logistics system that American planners depend on and had not modeled as vulnerable. The first measure, Canada is immediately suspending its operational commitments to the NATO Northern Logistics Corridor, pending a full review of Allied burden-sharing obligations. The Northern Corridor, The supply chain running from North American staging bases through Canadian territory across the North Atlantic to European deployment zones is not an abstraction. It is the physical path along which American heavy equipment, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcement troops move from bases in the continental United States to NATO's eastern flank. Canada provides the staging infrastructure, the port facilities, the airfield access, and the air defense coverage that makes this movement possible. Suspending Canadian operational commitments does not close the corridor immediately. It removes the Canadian elements that make the corridor functional, and those elements have no American substitute positioned to replace them. The second measure was the one that made the secure communication go private immediately. Canada is invoking NATO's burden-sharing consultation mechanism, Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, to formally request an alliance-wide review of American defense spending obligations relative to GDP. The United States spends approximately 3.5% of its GDP on defense. Canada spends approximately 1.4%. Washington has used that gap as leverage. What Canada's Article 3 filing documents is that American defense spending, when adjusted for the cost of maintaining global military presence unrelated to NATO's collective defense mission, Pacific operations, Middle East deployments, global basing costs, the NATO-specific American contribution is significantly lower than the headline figure suggests. Canada is not defending its own spending level. It is reframing the entire metric. And it has 14 months of legal and financial analysis supporting the reframing. But this is where the response became something beyond a defense spending dispute. The third measure, Canada is immediately activating bilateral logistics agreements with the United Kingdom, Germany, Norway, and Denmark, pre-negotiated frameworks under which those nations provide Canadian forces with alternative staging, transit, and logistics support that does not route through American-controlled infrastructure. The agreements had been prepared under the designation of NATO resilience planning, the entirely legitimate alliance practice of ensuring that no single node failure can paralyze collective operations. Canada had framed 11 months of preparation as resilience planning. It was. It was also the construction of a logistics architecture that functions around American participation rather than through it. The fourth measure was the one that silenced the room and sent the Saussure communication within the hour. Canada is suspending its contribution to the integrated air and missile defense system covering the North American Arctic approaches, specifically the Canadian-operated radar and interception systems that provide early warning coverage of the polar corridor used by Russian ballistic and hypersonic delivery systems targeting the continental United States. The suspension is framed as a technical review pending clarification of Allied obligations. Every air defense planner in Washington understood it as something else, the removal of the coverage layer that sits between Russian launch trajectories and American cities. Canada is not leaving NORAD. Canada is not withdrawing from NATO. Canada is placing its contributions under review, using precisely the language and mechanisms that the alliance's own founding documents provide for exactly this kind of burden-sharing dispute. Every action is legal. Every action is within Canada's treaty rights. And every action removes a load-bearing element from an architecture that Washington assumed was unconditionally available. The Pentagon's reaction was not public and not measured. 3 senior defense officials described the internal response as the most urgent operational concern raised inside the building since the early days of the Ukraine conflict. The Northern Logistics Corridor is not a convenience. It is the primary rapid reinforcement route for NATO's eastern flank. In a contested environment, a scenario NATO planners have been gaming extensively since 2022, the ability to move heavy equipment from American bases to European deployment zones within days rather than weeks is the difference between deterrence and exposure. Without Canadian staging, port access, and air defense coverage, that timeline extends in ways that fundamentally alter NATO's deterrent posture. The Joint Chiefs of Staff convened an emergency session. The Saussure requested an immediate call with the Canadian Chief of the Defense Staff. The call was granted. The contents were not disclosed. The fact that it was granted within 90 minutes of the measure announcement told the alliance everything it needed to know about which side of this dispute had operational leverage. Allied reaction broke entirely against Washington. The United Kingdom's Defense Secretary issued a statement describing Canada's burden-sharing concerns as legitimate and deserving of serious alliance consideration. Germany's defense minister went further, publicly endorsing Canada's Article 3 filing and calling for an emergency NATO ministerial to address burden-sharing methodology. Norway, whose own security depends directly on the Northern Logistics Corridor, expressed support for Canada's review process and confirmed activation of the bilateral logistics agreements. France issued a statement describing the American Defense Procurement Memorandum as a unilateral action inconsistent with alliance solidarity. 14 of NATO's 32 members issued statements within 6 hours. 12 of them supported Canada's position. 2 were neutral. 0 supported Washington's memorandum. The American defense industry's reaction was immediate and commercially brutal. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing Defense, and Northrop Grumman all flagged that the 180-day review suspension affecting Canadian embedded engineers would delay active program milestones with contractual penalty exposure. The 1,200 Canadian personnel suspended from access are not interchangeable with American engineers. They hold specific technical knowledge built over years of joint program participation that cannot be replaced by reassignment. 4 program managers at major defense contractors told industry media that the suspension creates delivery gaps that trigger automatic penalty clauses in existing government contracts. Washington's attempt to pressure Canada through defense industry access has generated penalty exposure for the same defense industry it was trying to protect. Trump has 3 paths, and the operational clock on each one is running faster than any previous confrontation. Maintain the memorandum and watch NATO's Northern Logistics Corridor degrade in real time as Canadian operational commitments remain under suspension. The corridor does not collapse overnight. It becomes less reliable, less redundant, and less capable of supporting the rapid reinforcement timelines that NATO's eastern flank deterrent posture requires. Every week the suspension continues is a week that Allied planners must account for a reduced northern capability, and that accounting is visible to every adversary with satellite reconnaissance and open-source analysis capability. Rescind the memorandum, but Canada's Article 3 filing is already submitted. The bilateral logistics agreements with the UK, Germany, Norway, and Denmark are already activated. The burden-sharing methodology reframing is already in 14 months of documented legal analysis that does not disappear because a memorandum is withdrawn. Canada has introduced a question into the alliance's institutional architecture that will be debated regardless of what Washington does next. Escalate further against a NATO ally, and accelerate the process by which 12 alliance members who have already issued supportive statements move from diplomatic solidarity to operational coordination with Canada's alternative logistics framework. 2 hours ago, the White House issued a memorandum it believed would pressure Canada through defense industry economics. 2 hours later, the Chasseur has sent a private communication. The Joint Chiefs have convened. 12 NATO allies have sided with Ottawa, and the Northern Logistics Corridor, the keystone of NATO's rapid reinforcement architecture, is under suspension by the one nation whose geography makes it irreplaceable. Carney called it Operation Keystone 11 months ago. He understood what Washington apparently did not. In an arch, the keystone does not need to fall. It only needs to shift. And when it shifts, every stone that depended on it feels the movement. Washington moved the keystone. The arch is feeling it now.